Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, continuing in this series, the title Lessons from Lockdown, and just a little brief recap. In the first one of the talks that we looked at was basically about the idea of utilizing adversity or crisis that we might face in life as an inspiration to try and look for and consider a new way of doing things. The idea of what can I learn from this? And so that had to do with the idea that a lot of people had hoped for, that going into this sort of lockdown and confronting this crisis, that somehow we would become better as people as a result of this crisis. Then the talk that we did last week, the second talk, we looked at the environmental crisis, and of course what spurred that was the fact that there's so much monumental change around the planet in terms of air pollution, water pollution, things like that. That just this massive change, and of course that raises the questions of how should we be addressing issues like the environment. So we use this as an example to point to the reality that simply changing the nature of the fuel that we use to fuel this lifestyle that we have, or these lifestyles, is not really going to make that much of a difference. We're headed in a bad direction. And what is it that lies at the root or the heart of the problem? The problem is not the nature of the fuel that we're using, for example, but rather that we're over-consuming. And so, we had titled the talk Greed Over Need, and how even top environmentalists have, pointed out that the root problem that we may be suffering from, it's not so much an environmental crisis as a spiritual crisis, that we as people are faced with this great emptiness that we're just seeking to fill through consumption of so many things. And it's not making us better as individuals or as people. So, and this truth is there not just for the environment, for instance, but many of the personal problems and the societal problems that we are facing, fundamentally, there's a spiritual underpinning. There is something wrong that actually needs to be addressed. And of course, the big question now, and what we'll just look at today briefly, is this question of, where do we head? Where do we go to for advice? What is going to be our guiding light? What's going to actually show the way forward? We see so many things, and I'll mention a few different situations in relation to this current crisis. I mean, you had so-called, major authorities in some countries promoting the idea that you shouldn't wear face masks, that it can even be worse for you, only to a few weeks later come out and say, no, they're recommending that everybody wear face masks. And it's kind of like a bit of a spinner, because we're having so many different opinions on how lockdown should be managed or not managed, or whether there should even be a lockdown, or how things should proceed. And people are sort of somewhat floundering and sort of guessing, and actually quite often going on emotion and just, whatever's moving a person at any one particular time, trying to consider how to deal with things. But, we're, we have difficulty actually seeing with clarity if we have already bought into a certain type of messaging. For instance, the idea that if you can consume more, you'll be happy. This is a pervasive idea. It's really pervasive. It's on all the social platforms and the news, advertising, the way people deal with each other. We're constantly pushing and receiving and having this idea reinforced that somehow if we consume more, we are going to be happy. And so when we hear something that's not aligned with that message, then it's sort of either it's going to bring doubts or we're going to sort of like just discard that message because it doesn't personally appeal. It's not in line with this other messaging that I've sort of bought into. And what that points to is the reality of how we lose objectivity and why there is a need for some guiding light. If I accept the fact that I am deeply influenced on many levels by other people's opinions and ideas and other types of messaging, then the only way I'm going to really be able to get past that or cut through that rather is if there is some very clear guiding light that I'm embracing and going, okay, this is true and this is the way we should go. And it sort of keeps me on course. So that problem though of the nature of our conditioning and the messaging that we're receiving, it's far more profound and deeper than any of us kind of realize. There's a professor from Harvard who wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. That sounds really ominous, and the reality is it is quite ominous. And, one example is how pervasive surveillance capital, well, maybe I will just look at that term a little bit. And it's about the principle of how big data gatherers are looking to harvest so much of your personal information on a really deep level so that they can influence you. They can sell things to you, that they can capitalize on sort of moods and things that you have. And even worse, they can create certain moods and things in you and then market to the fears or the anxiousness or the appetites that are created. This is like basic advertising on steroids. So a really good example of how this is working is in relation, for instance, to Google. Why did Google freely make available the Android platform? And I think the figure is something like 90% of the phones in the world are utilizing Android. When they first began, when it was first developed, there were a lot of ideas within Google that this becomes a new revenue stream for them. Perhaps they could sell phones with this already loaded. This would be just a whole new revenue stream for them. But there were other minds that prevailed and said that if we could make this available as close to zero cost as possible, that's even better for us. And the idea is, well, okay, why would you want to do that? What's the significance of doing that? And it has to do with the ability of this platform to harvest data. So they have these terms like behavioral surplus, and it's a form of data that they seek to capture, where they're not just looking to find out where you've been. They are doing things like monitoring the cadence of people's speech, the volume increases or decreases, and associating it through artificial intelligence with different types of mood transformations. And what's happened now is that companies that used to make apps and things for phones have now been kind of like pushed into, because it's economically beneficial for them and it's easier for them to get their apps accepted and promoted, that the apps should also be designed to collect excess data from individuals to really pull as much as possible and pass that on to large data consumers. And in effect, what you're having is it's like a form of data robbery, where so much information you're putting out there every day, not just through the phone, but all kinds of smart devices. And I mean, cars are going this way, and there is this desire to just capture everything. And then using these advanced, programming tools, they're going to make it so that they can capitalize and utilize that data. So, I think a good example of that, there was a couple of years ago, I think it was, where Google, it was Facebook execs offered marketing executives in Australia a new kind of potential or capacity. They said they had an unbelievable amount of data on 6.6 million users, mostly in Australia and some in New Zealand. And they said that with the amount of data they had, they can actually predict mood swings. And then they could pass on that information to people who could then try to capitalize on it. And this lady from Harvard gave this example that, for instance, somebody might be going out on a date and they're new to the dating world, or they're feeling very insecure about themselves. And just through their body language and the changes that they're, manifesting and just the ordinary things that they're doing, that the devices can really pick up on this. And then they can push this to a particular advertiser, somebody who's advertising a product, and say, here is a person that's really vulnerable right now. Why don't you shoot them off a product that can be a confidence boost? And so somebody shoots them off a product, a shirt, some fantastic new leather jacket or something that somebody feels is going to make a difference and make it easier for them to negotiate this social relationship they're seeking to develop, with this date. This is not an exaggeration. We've got two sort of examples. I remember there was one in America where they talked about a young woman who started ordering, there was a change in the shampoo that she was using, went from something that was highly fragrant to something that was almost fragrance-free, plus other sort of things. And they predicted, or the machines predicted, that she was potentially pregnant. Because when you become pregnant, quite often, your sensory receptors are sort of like peaking a little bit. And so there's this tendency to want to dial things down. And the girl's father started getting advertisements pushed to him for baby gifts. And the father was just like astonished. How come I'm getting these things? And asked the daughter, are you pregnant? And she said, no. But she decided to have a test because now there was a doubt in her mind, and it came back and she was pregnant. And so you have this situation where practically, the people harvesting and utilizing all this personal information about individuals almost know things that are, very personal before you even know it or recognize it. And of course, the big example was with, I don't know if you remember this name, Cambridge Analytica, and the huge thing that happened around the last, after the last US election, where they found Cambridge Analytica was selling on to Cambridge Analytica, Facebook was selling on, a lot of personal data, which was being used by Cambridge Analytica to sort of really highly target individuals and small groups in swing states in America that can really affect the outcome of an election, where you're talking about even a small percentage of people become moved. And the person that blew the whistle on them, somebody that worked inside, he was talking in interviews about how astonished he was about the degree of information that they had and their ability to move people, to trigger certain types of responses, and then to that response, to whatever they pushed to them when they had this triggered response, was then to feed something that made it more likely for them to consume or consider this. And they were really, really shaping opinion by doing it in a really subtle and kind of pretty horrible sort of way. Then another example that a lot of people are just totally oblivious to was this augmented reality. I mean, I love that word, augmented reality game, Pokemon Go. And when that was the big fad and people were traipsing around in groups all over the place, playing this game. And everybody just thought it was fun. They were just out there having fun. And it was just like, what's the big deal? Well, the reality is behind it, this product, Pokemon Go, is actually developed within Google. And they utilized technology that came from the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, which was the forerunner to Google Earth. And it was just like this big experiment. Can we move people to do things? And so it went from this concept of click-through, where people put advertising into media or things that people are consuming, and then you see a link and you go, oh, and you click on it and go somewhere. And somebody is going to pay for that. The website and the products that are being offered on it and everything, that website is paying money for all those click-throughs. So now we move to a whole different world where what they call footfall. This is a terminology that they use, where they literally try to get your feet into a particular store or into the proximity of a particular store. And not wanting to be looking like this was some big, negative sort of, they didn't want a negative thing attached to it. So they formed a company. It was called Niantic Labs, that put out Pokemon Go. And what was happening there was that, there was this move to get real bodies into or near business establishments and monitor whether they actually went in and consumed anything. So they have this whole terminology now around this technology where they're called lure modules, where they develop things and build them into other products, and they are meant to lure you into certain establishments or places where you are going to consume and spend money. And people just think they're having fun. Oh, this is so much fun. There's no big deal here. And they didn't see that this game they were playing was just a tiny part of a much bigger game that was being experimented with. So we're very much, and increasingly more and more so, being fed these kind of messages, buy this, do that. The idea of keep pushing yourself, strive, work really hard. We're having all these messages about really stimulating people. And this means putting people into states of anxiety. It's just like what greed does and envy, which were the foundational things used in the consumer economic model to get people to consume more and more and more stuff. It requires that people basically become unhappy or feel unhappy, feel that there is something really wrong in their life. There is something very, very much missing. But I'll just ask you to consider this. And this is a little story about Albert Einstein. I mean, everybody would probably agree that he was one of the most brilliant minds of the last century. There's probably no doubt about that. And he was visiting Japan. It was in 1922. And a bellboy came to his room to deliver some message. And he felt around in his pockets. He didn't have any money. And so he did this extraordinary thing. He took a piece of the notepad on the desk in his room, and he wrote a little, which is fundamentally a formula for happiness. He just wrote it and signed it and gave it to the bellboy, saying that, I'm a famous person. This will probably be worth more to you in the future than me giving you a tip now. Well, somewhat recently, a couple of years ago, it sold in auction, that note, for $1.5 million US. So he was absolutely correct in that. The message that he wrote is actually quite extraordinary. And it goes completely against the grain of where society is heading and what we are being told we need to be doing. This idea, buy this, do this, get that, achieve this, work really hard. This constant, and then you will be happy. That's the sort of like the tagline on the end of any of those types of things. So he said, a calm and modest life brings more happiness than the pursuit of success combined with constant restlessness. Just consider that for a moment. A calm and modest life brings more happiness than the pursuit of success combined with constant restlessness. I mean, that's a most extraordinary message. And it's brilliant. And it runs counter to everything that we're being fed. And the reason I'm bringing up this example and what he's talking about is that, one of the big lessons that we can learn is there is a need for us to change our list of priorities. There is a need for us to change, to some degree, our value system and to reconsider if we are to become happy, then we do need to take a deep, hard look at things. And I think before this crisis is finally over, many people will have rethought not only the sickness aspect of it, but the economic damage that we're likely to see as a result of all of this. It's all very unclear at this moment how bad things will be or will become. But the message is like critically important. And it's sort of like, well, how can he say that? He's obviously thought about it. He observes things very deeply. But the message that he espoused, he himself was not a deeply religious man at all. And yet the message that he espoused is the same as universal spiritual truth that mankind has had since almost time immemorial. And what I'm going to propose to you is that you and I, as individuals, we really, really need to consider what is going to be our guiding light. And it has to be something that is not going to be simply a product of my mind, which has been agitated and stimulated and filled with all kinds of messaging. I need to go to some really deep spiritual truth and make that my light, make that my anchor, and use that to guide my decision-making, my formulation of priorities, how I'm going to live, what actions am I going to undertake that will result in me becoming deeply satisfied, actually fulfilled, actually peaceful. Where am I going to find such truth? In the yoga system, it was pretty fundamental that the two things that you absolutely needed for clarity was to have the company of a person of vast spiritual intelligence and experience. Somebody that has lived, realized, experienced a higher spiritual truth and can share that with others. But the foundation of what was taught by such teachers who were very saintly in nature, that underlying truth that they spoke of was to be found in ancient spiritual texts that carried these messages, these eternal messages that are always available for all of mankind to help us see our way through the fog and the mist, through the dangerous waters, to a place of calm, a place of happiness and fulfillment. So in this regard, I just wanted to read a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is probably one of the most well-known of ancient yogic texts. And the message that it delivers, has been admired by great minds for centuries, for thousands of years in reality. What the Bhagavad Gita says in relation to what Einstein had just proposed and some of the things that we've been talking about, they have this verse that a person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, that person alone can achieve peace, and not the person who strives to satisfy such desires. And this is just like, what? This is just like radically different than things that we've been hearing. And they have this just wonderful comparison to an ocean. I mean, if you've seen some of the great rivers of the world, the Yangtze, the Ganges, the Ganga, the Amazon River, rivers that are like, 50 or 100 kilometers wide or more at their mouth, and just vast amounts of water flowing into the ocean. I mean, vast amounts where a couple of kilometers offshore you can dip into the water and it's somewhat, if not relatively, still fresh water, even though you're in the ocean itself, because it's so the volume is so great. And even though there's so many rivers rushing into the oceans maintain themselves in this calm state. And we are asked to become like that ocean, to learn to actually tolerate desires. The flood of desires are always going to be there, even without all this, high technology stimulation that we're getting these days. Still, the flood of desires are going to be there. And in this verse, it states that a person that who is not disturbed, they're not becoming disturbed by this incessant flow of desires, can alone achieve peace, and not the person or the man who strives to satisfy such desires. And this is just a radical idea. If you are being constantly stimulated and constantly being agitated by so many desires, seeking to fulfill those desires will not bring you peacefulness. It, in fact, has just the opposite effect. We're not talking about, people denying themselves so many things and, no, this is just a practical way to understand and begin looking at things. I can recognize that I may be agitated or stimulated by desire, but I don't have to chase it. I don't have to always follow it. And if I learn to become more tolerant of this, and in fact, if my life is more directed towards things that are more purposeful and meaningful, where I'm actually experiencing a deeper spiritual happiness and fulfillment, then I will have the opportunity to become truly peaceful. So for us to find this way forward, there is need for us as individuals, for ourselves, to find some actual guiding light, something that is going to help us cut through all of the clutter and din and noise and guide us towards the safe harbor of a peaceful and happy life. So with that, I would like to invite you to chant. This meditation, of course, is one of the principal ways in which a person can come to experience and achieve transcendental happiness. So we'll be singing the Gopala Govindarama Madana Mohana mantra. I'll sing it twice and then invite you to join in with me. Gopala Govindarama Madana Mohana Gopala Govindarama Madana Mohana Gopala Govindarama Madana Mohana Gopala Govindarama Madana Govinda Rama Madana Mohana Gopala 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 Govinda Rama Madana Mohana Madana Mohana Gopala Govinda Brahma Madana Mohana Gopala Govinda Brahma Madana Mohana Gopala Govinda Rama 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 Madana Mohana Gopala